Okay, we're going to switch gears here. And this next section talks about different methods of adapting practice and the impact that this has on the outcome of those we're serving. And I know some of you will be happy to see some of these because anecdotally, these have been talked about, several of these have been talked about in my career for some time, where people say, culture really matters, or, honoring client preference really matters, or, somebody's spiritual beliefs really matter in terms of their outcome, or stages of change, which we've talked a lot about, really matter. And they do. But there hasn't been a ton of good, robust research that kind of teases out how those things matter. How much do they matter? When are they the primary thing you should be focusing on as opposed to a secondary thing? All those kind of questions crop up around the issue of how much does it matter. And so we're gonna take a walk through these 8 in the rest of our time here. And we're going to talk about what these are defined as and how much, in fact, they do matter. So these are categorized similarly to the relationship factors in terms of level of efficacy. So the strongest evidence, the most demonstrably effective methods of adapting practice include taking these 4 elements into consideration: reactance or resistance level, preferences, culture, and religion or spirituality. So we're going to first look at reactance or resistance level. I love this quote from Bill Miller, one of the folks who has popularized motivational interviewing. When my client disagrees with me, I call it resistance. But when they agree with me, I call it insight. Okay? And he says that tongue-in-cheek, obviously. But really, it raises the question about what is resistance, right? Is it a state or a trait? Sometimes the discussion goes. If resistance was a trait, then you would expect research to find that there's a certain percentage of people on planet Earth who are born with this innate trait of resistance. And no matter what the circumstances or what the approach that somebody takes to working with them, they would be resistant, non-compliant, other labels that have been associated with that sort of concept. And sometimes, sadly, because I don't think it's accurate, sometimes we treat clients as if their resistance or non-compliance was in fact a trait, an inbred trait, rather than a state. And by state, I mean something that fluctuates depending on different conditions or circumstances that happen within the therapeutic relationship, okay? And that's where the notion of reactance comes in. Reactance is the client reacting to something the practitioner does, okay? So this would beg the question, is somebody being resistant or non-compliant, does that have to do with an inbred trait that they were born with and that is immovable and unsolvable, or does it have to do with their reactance to something that I am, as the practitioner, doing or not doing? And I think the evidence lines up on the side of it being a state, not a trait, right? And so what happens when our client is resistant or non-compliant? How do we respond to that in terms of our service or our treatment? This looked at studies that had a pretty high treatment effect finding for pairing highly resistant individuals with a particular approach for service delivery or treatment delivery, and pairing low resistance individuals with more directive type therapies, okay? So that's worth paying attention to. And if you've done any training in motivational interviewing, this will not come as a surprise to you. If people present because of their personality type and whatever the conditions or circumstances that happen to align well for them as being low resistant, then it works a lot better to be more directive. That may be a reflection of resolved ambivalence. It could be a reflection of that person being in a good action stage place that makes them a wonderful candidate for any number of action stage designed treatments, which often include more direct advising or coaching or instruction. And if you've got somebody who that works well with, not surprising that that would be the type of treatment or service style that would be a good fit and that they would have good outcomes. Conversely, the person who is resistant or non-compliant, if that could be understood as an expression of a high ambivalence, then it makes sense that they would not do well by being paired up with a directive, advice-giving, instructive kind of approach. Because as motivational interviewing has taught us, you can predict what happens when you get too directive with an ambivalent person. If you argue for change in a confrontational or directive manner with a highly ambivalent person, the predictable response is that the person will argue the other side of the change argument. They will argue against change if you're arguing strongly for change and that person is highly ambivalent. And we may even drive them more firmly or deeply into their ambivalence rather than helping them out of it by taking that ill-fitting approach of being confrontational with the highly ambivalent, resistant person, okay? So it just kind of makes intuitive sense that less, directive, less confrontational approaches would work better with somebody who's presenting with that kind of resistant type of presentation. It's interesting to consider that in Miller and Rolnick's third edition of their motivational interviewing book, that they have done away with the word resistance. And to hear them tell it, they've always been a little bit uncomfortable with that term, because what kind of association comes to your mind when you think about a resistant client? It kind of sounds negative. It kind of sounds like it's something about the client that they need to change in order to make progress. And that's really not the approach that motivational interviewing takes. Motivational interviewing absolutely describes the lack of change as a state and not a trait, and one that can be influenced by the practitioner using motivational interviewing skills and techniques. And so in this third edition of their book, they took out the word resistance, but they had to figure out another word to put in its place, and they actually came up with two words to describe that phenomenon that most people understand if they have a good, comprehensive reckoning of what's happening when somebody's acting in a resistant fashion. They came up with two words. One was sustain, and that's supposed to be just a neutral word that's the opposite of change. So somebody's either in a change place or a sustained place, like sustain the status quo, not interested in changing, not in the market for changing. So you've got this neutral word, change, this neutral word, sustain, right? To avoid negative association with either one. But then what happens, the other word that they came up with is intended to describe what happens if the client I'm working with is in a sustained place, like not ready to change, more leaning toward maintaining the status quo, but the practitioner is in a change place. So what happens when the change-oriented practitioner comes across the sustained kind of positioned client? What happens is discord, right? It's a mismatch. I'm arguing for change with somebody who's too ambivalent to really respond to that well. And so that discord or sustain and discord have replaced the phenomenon of resistance when it gets written about and talked about in Miller and Rolnick's third edition. And I think it's a useful change because it puts some of the responsibility where it belongs, namely on us. It's our job increasingly as we become knowledgeable in motivational enhancement and stage-wise treatment to be able to recognize when somebody is highly ambivalent and to adjust our interventions accordingly so that we don't do what's predictable, which is drive that person more firmly into their sustained position by prematurely arguing too strongly for change before that person's willing and ready and able to hear it and respond to it positively. So the findings of that element of reactance resistance are not surprising in light of what we know from motivational interventions. Preferences are the next one, and this is an interesting one. This has to do with treatment matching in a different sort of way. We talk about treatment matching for stage of readiness or stage of change. This has to do with treatment matching for different characteristics that can impact the preferred conditions under which somebody wants to receive services or treatment. Pretty significant effect size for retaining somebody in treatment, and a moderately strong effect size for impacting improvement on the things that were the goals of treatment. And so what are the different service characteristics, if you will, that a client may have a preference about that we should honor to the extent reasonably possible? How about who does what in the treatment relationship, right? Is my person, because of their stage of change or their personality type, are they very open and welcoming of advice giving by the practitioner? They want to be given more direct advice or direction? Or do they want the practitioner to be more of a sounding board, a good listener, a reflective listener, let's say, and they come in with whatever the issue that they need to talk through, and they want a practitioner who's willing to listen, excuse me, willing to listen and reflect back, but not be too directive or advice giving in their stance. Does somebody have a strong preference because of where their confidence lies in different types of treatment services? Have a strong preference for individual work versus group work. That's another area where it would play into, if you have both in your treatment array, and to the extent possible and clinically indicated, can match that person according to their preferences, that's only going to have a positive impact on the outcome of that treatment. How about characteristics of the actual practitioner? Male, female, older, younger, of a particular skin color or ethnic or racial persuasion, lived experience or not lived experience, okay? Those are all practitioner characteristics. We may know, or we may have pretty strong beliefs that if somebody's ready to change, those things don't matter so much, but not all of our people are ready to change, right? And so if we're engaging with an ambivalent person, does it not make sense to try to honor their preferences, because that's where they're currently at, that's where they have confidence that would be the optimal source of help for them. And again, that's why I keep using the qualifier to the extent reasonably possible. If you're part of a small organization that doesn't have a wide diversity of practitioners along those different characteristics, you may be limited in what you have to offer. If somebody wants to swap or switch out practitioners on the basis of one or more of these things, and they believe in that pretty strongly, then why not honoring that? Now, there is a risk there, and I'm sure some of you are thinking about that. The risk of people who just really are so ambivalent that they don't really want to be in any kind of treatment or service delivery, and they're throwing up kind of excuses, let's say, or reasons why, and so you switch them once, then they don't like that practitioner, and they're keying on another personal characteristic that would really work better, so you switch them twice, and they want a third switch. At some point, if there's a pattern where that's what's going on, as opposed to a person really being able to respond better to a practitioner who has certain characteristics that they really have a stronger confidence will be able to help them. If it's just a shopping process without any more sincere attempt to have those things line up in a way that the client can engage and make progress, then obviously, there need to be limits put on that. But to the extent possible initially, if preferences regarding the practitioner can be honored, it's worth considering doing that. How about type of intervention? How about the client believes that, formal individual talk therapy is a bunch of hoo-ha, but 12-step fellowship groups are really the cat's meow. Are we going to insist, no, you got to come to individual therapy with me every week? Or are we willing to say, you know what, let's test drive your treatment preferences, and let's try, what you believe would be the most successful for you. Try, 3 meetings a week and revisit it and see how it goes. And if that's sufficient, win-win. If it's not sufficient, maybe we tweak the treatment plan, or maybe you become more open to adding whatever other thing, maybe a treatment group, a facilitated treatment group, or an individual counseling session in order to improve your, the effectiveness of your recovery plan. But not starting out with a preconceived notion that, well, I have this formula and this is what everybody gets plugged into regardless of their personal preferences. Research indicates that's not useful. And whereas honoring people's preferences is useful in terms of the contribution to the treatment effect that happens as a result. How about pharmacology or psychotherapy? That's another treatment difference that people can really have faith in one or the other and not necessarily both. Do we honor that, right? Is psychosocial interventions where somebody's head is at, that they believe and have confidence in, is going to be effective for them? Or do they believe that some of the, more recently available, pharmacological interventions like Suboxone for heroin or other opiate addiction is really the key to getting clean and sober? And if they can just get that as a tool in their recovery toolbox, they can work on the rest of the stuff on their own. Again, the caution is against being preconceived in our notions of what everybody must do in order to appropriate sustainable recovery, and instead be at least willing to test drive their preferences on the front end and see if they work. The other thing that does, especially with ambivalent individuals, is it frees us up from the power struggle that would otherwise be there. And the power struggles are wastes of time and energy and focus. So if we insist on, nope, you can't do the thing you want to do, you must do the thing that I tell you to do or that our program tells you to do, and you're working with an ambivalent person, you've just been coercive with an ambivalent person with the predictable result that they will probably not engage fully and may just bail out or vote with their feet, because now it's become a power struggle between what they want and what you want, and the actual treatment goal of obtaining and maintaining sustainable recovery progress has been lost or put in second place behind that recovery or that power struggle.